Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Nature Conservancy in Alaska's effort this summer to inform, educate, and engage Alaskans on the merits of bipartisan climate solutions through its Alaska Climate Opportunities Assessment. TNC partnered with McKinley Research Group to independently commission research on Alaska's unique opportunities to address climate change and assess the economic implications of recent, current, and future investments or policies. During this discussion, we will explore the efforts and perspectives of renewable energy leaders from across the state, opportunities stemming from their work, and the initial findings from the Alaska Climate Opportunities Assessment. My name is Heidi Hansen, and I will be moderating our esteemed panel. While I'm not currently working in the renewable space, I have long had climate, Alaska, and renewables on my mind, and thus was happy to participate in this dialogue. My background is a little different than most of our panelists, so I will share it with you to shed a little light on where my questions may come from and to hopefully color the conversation on climate with a little different shade of green. My foray into renewable work began at the Pentagon as part of the solution set for operational readiness and climate-related challenges. I was originally recruited to Army General Counsel's office to negotiate large-scale privatized housing projects. But in 2012, in response to our Commander-in-Chief's State of the Union address, the Department of Defense devised a 25% renewable energy goal by 2025, so I pivoted to energy. I quickly came to realize the individual installations around the country have a need and desire to be independent of energy, just as our smaller communities around Alaska, and it became apparent that our forward operating bases in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Djibouti have, or in the case of Afghanistan now had, operational needs for which they can't be dependent on surrounding infrastructure, just as many of our villages around Alaska. With ever increasing technological advancements, our military, just like our society, has exponentially increasing energy needs writ large. Where the Navy has the mission to command ships further while fueling up less frequently for operational benefits, I can only imagine, without being an expert on the Alaska Marine Highway, that our ferry system would be economically benefited, and thus our coastal communities would be benefited if it too could similarly travel further on less fuel. What I didn't know when I was working towards a 25% renewable goal for the military was that Alaska's legislature had set an even higher bar for production of renewable energy in Alaska, 50% renewable by 2025. The McKinley report notes that as of 2019, 30% of Alaska's energy came from renewable facilities. This statistic is the result of 260 projects around the state benefiting 160 communities. Comparatively, the Army, with tremendous bureaucratic, fiscal, consumptive demand, and land resources, achieved about half of its goal in the same period of time, from what I understand. I'm not there anymore, so take that with a grain of salt. Our military, similar to so many of our coastal communities, experienced significant challenges from climatic changes as well. Where NOAA's community experienced erosion from melting permafrost, some of our infrastructure at our Navy bases is being overtaken by rising sea levels. Whether it's moving communities or rebuilding military infrastructure, there are significant social costs to the changes we are seeing in our climate. Notably, Alaska is warming at 2 to 3 times the rate of the global average, so we should expect the impacts to be that much more severe and thus the cost to be significantly greater. For those of you who prefer concrete approximations, McKinley notes that the federal government social cost is $51 for each metric ton of CO2 emissions released. The military continually assesses and monitors potential sources of friction that could lead to acts of war. As it relates to climate, just a couple of examples include potential water shortages in certain parts of the world, or emerging trade routes that are expected in the Arctic, for which China and Russia have long signaled intentions to dominate. Needless to say, my mind frequently wandered home thinking about how my work might translate. After several years serving as the Army's senior energy lawyer, I had the great fortune to serve as counsel at the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee under the chairmanship of Senator Murkowski. While I worked on natural resources, I continually was reminded of our energy challenges through the lens of mining. The state of Alaska has tremendous mineral potential, particularly in the critical mineral space. Currently, the United States imports 100% of its consumption of 14 critical minerals and 50% of its consumption of another 14 critical minerals. Minerals necessary for everything from smartphones in our pockets, solar panels on our roofs, renewable battery capacity in our cars, to major weapon systems for our military. President Trump and President Biden independently have stated domestic supply of these mineral resources is critical for our nation. But where so many of these resources exist in Alaska, and often only in Alaska, it's costly just to explore for these mineral sources, much less construct and operate mines in the remote locations where God left them. Cost-effective, large-scale renewable energy sources, either standing alone or in combination with traditional fuel, would afford Alaska significantly greater capacity. And of course, mining is just one of many industries that would greatly benefit from cleaner and cheaper power in Alaska. Speaking of industry, just a couple of days ago, CNBC published an article that said, despite our tax climate being ranked third in the nation, Alaska, for the 6th time in 14 years, ranked last in the nation for quote unquote business, last. And the first thing it cited was our oppressive quote unquote energy costs. We're double the national average and second only to Hawaii. Much of this cost is a result of high transportation cost, delivering fuel to isolated communities. And despite our high energy costs and our relatively tiny population, we're 4th in the nation for energy consumption. This is unsustainable for our state. As an optimist, I habitually focus on the opportunities that stem from challenges. Fortunately, like so many other things in Alaska that we have bigger and better, we have tremendous renewable resource potential to capture in hydroelectric, wind, solar, biomass, tidal, and geothermal energy sources. We currently have significant wind and solar farms along the rail belt, a power system that delivers about 79% of Alaska's energy resources. We have small scale solar and wind powering outposts in small communities throughout Alaska. We have significant hydropower resources powering communities such as Juneau, which makes power one of the few things that's cheap in Juneau. And Kodiak, investing early on, installed so much wind that it has not only almost completely reduced fuel consumption powering homes and businesses, but made some unique investments such as its renewable powered crane, which keeps its port operating cleanly. So I'm excited to have this panel introduce themselves and share with us some of the work they are doing to help chip away at some of Alaska's significant energy and climate challenges while creating new opportunities in Alaska in this dawn. After the panelists have all had an opportunity to share a little bit of their perspective, we will open it up for questions from the audience. So Jen, I'd like to start with you. Jen is a CEO of Renewable IPP. She's a professional mechanical engineer with 12 years experience in the energy industry. She grew up in Eagle River and has a vested interest in Alaska's energy supply. Jen has developed and implemented department-wide strategies and managed small and large-scale projects. She specializes in building relationships with her focus on integrity and has a history of aligning complex teams to a common goal. Jen has a passion for making an impact and applies this to renewable energy in Alaska. So welcome, Jen.
Thanks very much, Heidi. Yeah, and thank you all for joining on this session. Really looking forward to it. Yeah, so as Heidi mentioned, I'm the CEO of Renewable IPP. We develop and build utility scale solar farms here in Alaska. And yes, I have a history of working in oil and gas, both doing technical, project management, and business related jobs. And I'm happy to report that I've pulled on all of those skills in working on our new business here in Alaska. And it is neat to see that a lot of those skills, you know, a technical energy project, whether it's oil and gas or renewable energy, those skills transfer. And so the good news is we have a very skilled workforce here in Alaska, and hopefully we can start to transition more of those skills to renewable energy. Renewable IPP was founded in 2017 by myself and my 3 business partners, all of who are engineers. And Renewable IPP, we're passionate about 2 things. First is increasing, significantly increasing our renewable energy here in the state. But then equally important is doing that economically so that we do not increase the cost of energy to Alaskans. And I think so many folks have in their minds, just the history of wind and solar just being such expensive technologies, not cost competitive with fossil fuel generation. And, just a data point is in the last 10 years, the cost of solar has reduced by 80%. So it's just plummeted and it is now competitive with fossil fuels. And we can broadly deploy that and not increase the cost of energy to Alaskans. At Renewable IPP, we handle our projects from cradle to grave. And so we develop the project, which means finding land, agreeing a contract to sell the power to the utility, and we bring in private investment to take on the upfront capital risk of that project and fund the project. I'm proud to report that we have built Alaska's largest solar farm out in Willow. It has a total capacity of about 1.4 megawatts. And the way that project works is we sell power to Manusco Electric at what it costs them to make to generate electricity themselves. And so it's cost neutral to the utility members and does not increase the energy cost. Now, currently we're developing projects anywhere from 5 megawatts to 20 megawatts all across the state. And we are now targeting to work towards contracts that would actually be lower than the utility's current cost of generation. So it actually have a price suppressing effect. And we're on target to do that. Yeah, I'm really excited to be part of the panel discussion today. You know, a lot of times renewable energy discussions focus on the carbon side of the discussion, which is of course the driver. But I also think I'm just super excited about the economic development opportunity. Just looking at Alaska alone, if we want to decarbonize electricity, we're looking at roughly $5 billion in investment. And that number comes from scaling up, you know, in the last 10 years, about 700 million has been spent on increasing our renewable energy generation from 20% to 30%. And so if we want to decarbonize that remaining 70%, then we're looking at $5 billion in infrastructure investment in our state. And so that's a huge win for, you know, where we're looking at as the oil and gas industry may shrink, that is a great opportunity for folks to transition to the renewable energy sector, and will create a lot of jobs. One thing that's neat, or one thing that's for renewable energy, the land footprint is larger than traditional energy forms, and so we are typically looking at developing projects outside of the cities. And what's neat is then we create jobs where there typically aren't very many. And so we're seeing new opportunities to develop jobs outside of the cities, in addition to support services that may come from the city. So it's a win-win across the state. Given my oil and gas background, I look at all the energy sources. And, right now about 50% of our electricity is generated by the Cook Inlet gas field, and that is about a 60-year-old field. And we, by the end of this decade, I think we'll use up a lot of the easy to access reserves, and we will start to see a cost impact as we have to access harder to get to reserves. So it's a great time for us to be diversifying our energy mix so that we can reduce the pressure on that resource and help combat escalating energy prices for Alaskans with renewable energy. Electricity accounts for about 27% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, but it can actually have a much bigger impact than that. So if we can decarbonize electricity, because there's known technologies for electrifying transportation, so electric vehicles, and also heating and cooling, if we can actually address 50% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide by electrifying, or generating with renewable energy, the electricity sector, transportation, and heating, cooling, that accounts for 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. So, focusing on where we have known technologies that we can deploy now, we can really have an outsized impact on our carbon footprint. And so, yeah, in closing, I think, there's just a huge economic opportunity for Alaska. $5 billion of infrastructure investment that will create jobs. And given the way that renewable energy technologies are reducing in cost, we can actually help reduce energy prices for Alaskans. So of course it has its challenges, all projects do, but it's a good news story. And look forward to today's discussion. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Jen. Next, we're going to go to Gwen. Gwen Holdman is the founder and director of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. She's an applied energy researcher based at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which focuses on the community scale fossil and renewable alternative energy technology space. Specific areas of emphasis include power systems integration for microgrids, hydrokinetic energy, low temperature geothermal, and diesel efficiency. Prior to joining the university, Gwen worked in the private sector as a design engineer and project manager, including the design and construction of the only operating geothermal power plant in Alaska at Chena Hot Springs. In addition, just a couple fun facts, Gwen has also competed in the Yukon Quest and Iditarod sled dog races. So welcome, Gwen.
Thank you, Heidi. Yeah, I share Jen's excitement and enthusiasm for participating on this panel. I really appreciate the diversity of speakers. Looks like you're starting with the two mechanical engineers, so that's kind of fun as well. But as you mentioned, Heidi, we are an applied energy research program based at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but we have a little bit of a different emphasis than research at a university typically does, and that we are very much thinking about how the university can provide tools and resources to help see projects developed in the near term here in Alaska, and also connecting Alaskans with similar places globally that have similar sorts of energy challenges. So we're based at UAF. We have very much a statewide mission and emphasis. We have a team in Anchorage of about 7 folks, and that's actually, they work quite a bit with Jen on our solar energy initiative. We have a couple folks in Juneau as well. And so, you know, even though our renewables are a main focus for us, it's not the only thing we're looking at. We really try to look at these sorts of challenges pretty holistically, not just about energy production, but how people really use energy in their daily lives, and how we can really impact not so much necessarily focusing on the carbon reduction piece, but really looking at local energy solutions so that production is as close as possible to the end user, so you have better energy security, that you're using things as efficiently as possible, and that we're looking at ways to reduce energy costs for Alaskans. And one of the things I really want to emphasize, I think that is important to me, is like how inspiring I think Alaskans really are in terms of like their efforts in this particular space. I'm actually sitting in Cordova right now, Cordova, Alaska, and this is an example of a community that's worked very hard to transition to 100% renewables in sometimes like pretty difficult sorts of circumstances. And the reason is because we don't have an integrated grid here in Alaska. So most of these communities are operating independently from any kind of a larger grid. So generation is local, consumption of whatever power is produced is local. And then you're looking at the other types of energy uses, especially space heating in a lot of communities is a pretty high cost to in many places. And because we have this sort of unique sort of opportunity here in Alaska, where we've got all these little miniature experiments related to energy production and development and super vertically integrated electric utilities, you can do things here quickly and on a basis that really can't be done in a lot of other places. There's a ton of experimentation happening here. A place like Cordova, where you've got real high variation in loads seasonally and even within a day due to like when the fish processors are online, when the hydro is running. They have run-of-river hydro here. They've got a storage, energy storage, and they've got diesel. And how can you best take advantage of that mix of resources so that you're saving consumers money, that you're being super innovative? We just talked about earlier today about how Cordova was actually the first community in the US that actually switched to LED streetlights, for example. Looking at those sorts of opportunities, Alaskans are really thinking ahead of the curve, and they have the tools at their disposal to often be pretty creative, develop things quickly, because you don't have a lot of bureaucracy that's sort of getting in the way of looking at some of these technology transitions. So I would actually like to argue that Alaska is sort of a leader in some of these energy transitions. And a place like Cordova, I think, could actually be a little bit of a place for the country where we could test strategies for transitioning to higher and higher contribution levels of variable renewable energy resources. And so looking at beneficial electrification. Today, I drove here to this office in an electric vehicle that was charged using local hydropower, right? A plug-in electric vehicle. And so there's some really cool things happening here. And I would like to say that Alaska in general is not the place, even though despite the fact that this report really talks about like a high proportion of emissions in Alaska, a lot of that has to do with industry. It's not community-based emissions. There are high energy costs and high, but people aren't using more electricity or energy here in Alaska than other similar sorts of places. We are working very hard to transition. There are communities here that are getting very close to 100% renewables for power generation, Cordova being one. How can we sort of mirror these kinds of successes in other places in the country or other places globally? Because that's really what it's going to take to address this broader question around carbon from a societal standpoint, from a global standpoint. I think Alaska can be part of the solution because we're sort of at that forefront and part of that technology transition at sort of that leading edge. And I'm excited about that. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to be in Alaska working on these sorts of things.
Thanks so much, Gwen. So next we'll hear from Chris Rose. He's the founder and executive director of REAP, or Renewable Energy Alaska Project. He has worked as a fundraiser for various nonprofit public interest groups around the United States. He earned his law degree from the University of Oregon with a certificate in environmental and natural resources law. For 12 years, his practice in Alaska included representation of Native Alaskans from Northwest Arctic villages and the mediation of a variety of disputes around the state. He's been very active in the local community affairs arena and has served on various statewide boards, including the Renewable Energy Grant Fund Advisory Committee, which he currently chairs. From 2004 to 2008, he wrote a monthly column for the Anchorage Daily News, and he enjoys traveling, gardening, and exploring Alaska. Good morning, Chris. You're muted.
Good morning, and thank you all for this panel this morning. I'm very happy and interested to be here and to see everybody. REAP is a statewide nonprofit group that got together back in 2004 with a vision that Alaska could and should be a leader in clean energy development. We promote energy efficiency and renewable energy. We're a coalition of about 65 dues-paying organizational members that all bring different perspectives to the table. We also are supported by a number of organizations, including state and federal agencies that we work with very closely. And the goal here is really just to develop more renewable energy in the state of Alaska and to promote energy efficiency. And the way we look at the clean energy transition for Alaska is really in 4 buckets. The first one is technology. And while none of us at REAP are engineers and we're not developing technology, we help translate what technology is all about to the public and to policymakers so we can educate people about how technology is changing so quickly. The second bucket is people. And we spend a ton of our time promoting capacity building around the state because the 21st century jobs are going to require some new skills that are also just going to require education and a different perspective. Many of the 21st century jobs in clean energy are just going to be the trades who shift from being an electrician working on one kind of project to a different kind of project, or a pipe fitter, or so on. We have 4 people on staff that are really focused on building capacity around the communities that we serve, which is really pretty much everywhere in the state. 3 STEM educators who are working to promote energy efficiency and renewable energy curriculum. So kids understand where energy comes from and the implications of all their energy decisions. And that translates to their parents learning a little bit more about where energy comes from, working a lot on training opportunities and collaboration between existing entities so we can get the most out of the existing entities that already are trying to promote energy efficiency and renewable energy training around the state. A third bucket is really finance. We're not going to have a clean energy transition here without money. One of the things that we did early on was help to develop the Renewable Energy Fund that was passed by the legislature back in 2008. And the legislature put about $270 million into that fund so far. That's leveraged more than $200 million in federal and private money. That is the lion's share of the money that developed the projects that Heidi and others have already talked about. So a lot of the leg up that we've got as a state now with developing so many small wind diesel and other kinds of small microgrids around the state is because the state legislature put money into that early on and really invested in it and got the private sector to do something about it too. We're now looking at a situation where we're not going to have nearly as much grant money to do that. So we've been promoting the idea of private sector funding through a green bank. And there's been a bill just introduced recently to develop a statewide green bank that would sit under the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority. The last bucket is policy. And really that's a bucket that brings all of these things together. Besides the Renewable Energy Fund, we promoted early on the idea that efficiency is first. We have to look at how we are using our energy and not wasting it before we develop new projects. There's no point in generating a BTU or a kilowatt hour if you're not going to use it efficiently. So early on, the legislature put $640 million into building energy efficiency. That's had an incredible payoff. We think that that's important because that'll help size what kinds of projects we need here in the future, both on the electricity side and on the heating side. We have a lot of other policy challenges, though, in front of us, despite the fact that we have a nominal goal of 50% renewables by 2025. That's simply a goal. There's no teeth to that. And we need to have some kind of a policy that really has some teeth. So we're working right now through our public policy committee to develop a renewable portfolio standard that would work for the rail belt, which is where about 75% of all the electricity in the state is currently produced. That could really help both the rail belt consumers, but also people around the state, because the folks who are working on these microgrids would have more support here in the state of Alaska. We've got huge opportunities for developing the renewable energy resources that we have here. And we've got some big challenges with our dependency on natural gas. We get about 85% of the rail belt's power through natural gas, and yet we have a monopoly right now that is controlling about 85% of that gas. We're paying way more than double what the utilities in the lower 48 pay for natural gas. And we've got a natural gas infrastructure that is really getting old and needing replacement. We've seen already the federal regulators requiring that some of that be rebuilt. So that's all going to be a cost. And we have to look at the opportunity cost. What are we going to spend our money on? What are we going to envision for our state? Meanwhile, we've got, for instance, one of the best tidal resources in the world here in Cook Inlet, that when we have technology that can exploit that economically, could literally run the state of Alaska and certainly the South Central Alaska in perpetuity. And that's one of the great things about renewables. They are not finite resources, they're infinite resources. So we're very excited about the vision for Alaska that we've got. And we also have to be really careful about making sure that we understand where the puck is going to be. Right now, people who are just skating to where the puck is are going to miss opportunities, but we have to see across the horizon and see where other places are going. I mean, just this week, we saw the European Union announce their decarbonization goals, which is going to force the rest of the world to rethink how they are going to be looking at carbon. So Alaska has an exciting opportunity to be both a leader in efficiency and renewables, and I'm excited to be part of this panel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. Your enthusiasm is contagious. So our next speaker is Curtis Thayer. He is the Executive Director of the Alaska Energy Authority, the state's energy office and lead agency for statewide energy policy and program development. Prior to AEA, Thayer served at, sorry, Curtis served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Alaska Chamber of Commerce. Previous to that position, he served as Commissioner for the Department of Administration, as a cabinet member for the Governor's Office under Sean Parnell. And additionally, his public service includes time as the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development, and working in DC with Congressman Don Young and Senators Stevens and Lisa Murkowski. So Curtis is a graduate of UAF. He served on several boards across the state, and we're so happy to have you. You're muted, Curtis.
All right, thank you very much for having me and for putting together this forum. A little bit about AEA. AEA is kind of known as the state's energy office, and we have 6 different programs or services that we provide. One is with the Railbelt Energy. We own, AEA owns the largest hydro project in the state, being the Bradley Lake project. We work with the 5 utilities on the management of that project, and it provides 120 megawatts into the grid, about 10% of the Railbelt needs. We look at a lot of opportunities to expand that. Most recently, we did a $47 million upgrade called the Battle Creek Diversion Project. We diverted Battle Creek into Bradley Lake. That alone is providing energy for 5,100 homes, electricity for 5,100 homes with that one project. We also own transmission lines on the Kenai, as well as from Willow to Healy, about 200 miles of transmission lines. We are the largest owner of transmission lines, followed with MEA and Golden Valley and Chugach Electric. But with that, the line ownership just between Willow to Healy saves the Fairbanks consumer $40 million in energy, and also allows them to receive 17% of the power from Bradley Lake into the Fairbanks community. So those are our owned assets. We're looking at different ways, like I said, to maximize those. We also have the Power Cost Equalization Program, which is a program that is designed to help lower the cost of energy in rural Alaska. It looks at the cost of power between Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau, establishes a base rate. The Regulatory Commission does. It's about 20 cents. And then the PCE program is to offset what that 20 cents is versus the cost in that particular rural community, usually off the rail belt, less than 2,000 people. Right now, the legislature chose not to fund PCE this year. It is part of the special session. It's one of those things that I think has a lot of unintended consequences that the legislature just aren't quite necessarily aware of. But hopefully they can get the 3/4 sweep and the funding goes back into those communities, because it is a lifeline. It's about $35–40 million on a given year into rural Alaska. So that's a particular challenge that we have. And then also with rural energy, we have about 193 communities that we support either through upgrades to their powerhouses. And when we do upgrades, we're always looking for ways to lessen diesel. And then also bulk fuel. We have over $800 million of deferred investment in bulk fuel tanks. And so when you look at that, you know, whether we try to transition some of these communities off of diesel, but if they stay on diesel, there's an $800 million cost right there, just on updating those bulk fuel facilities. With renewable energy, we have, as Chris had mentioned and others, we have the Renewable Energy Fund, which has been funded about $270 million. It's funded about 90 active projects, or I should say 99 is officially, and we have 27 currently in development, and we have 11 projects pending funding before the legislature, $4.6 million worth that we believe we have the support for, so we hope to see that money be coming through shortly. Also with our renewable energy, we recently received a $21 million build grant. It's the largest build grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation on the West Coast, and that is to help with Alaska cold storage at the airport, to work on energy efficiency and also to incorporate renewables into the building. You know, it's the overall project cost is $220 million. And so I think it's pretty unique that AEA found a way, working with the federal government and partnering with the private sector, to have a $20 million investment in that. And not only will that create a couple thousand construction jobs, but 120 year-round jobs. So it's kind of a unique place to be. We do a lot of grants and loans. A lot of the grants, whether they be with the Renewable Energy Fund, when we talk about when we talk about Willow Farm, they work with us. We partnered with them for a Power Project Fund loan. Pillar Mountain down in Kodiak, we have over $40 million invested in that. $25 million was an investment with Fire Island transmission line. Even Eva Creek, we have tens of millions of dollars invested in that project in solar through the state. And then most recently, Halungnai, which hopes to take Prince of Wales Island to almost 100% renewable. We have $27 million invested in that project through grants and our loan program. So we're pretty dedicated and pushing more towards loans, as grant money is not necessarily as readily available. And we also provided, working with the Denali Commission and Wells Fargo, about $1.7 million into LED lighting into small rural communities in rural Alaska, which actually was a huge win. You know, Wells Fargo had $1 million in a grant or what they wanted to use for public service. We matched it, and then we also had the Denali Commission help match and fully subscribed all the communities that applied. And then with energy planning, again, we kind of look across, especially if we're trying to focus on rural Alaska, on looking at how we integrate renewable resources into rural Alaska. But we must start with addressing the diesel power generation controls and distribution systems, and careful consideration to the sizing of energy story and dispatch is critical. You know, and one thing is with often overlooked is the potential impacts to the power cost utilization and waste heat recovery. If the renewable source reduces the availability of the energy needed for PCE, then the RCA lowers that cost. And so that's an issue with, we want to work the RCA, that communities shouldn't be penalized just because they use waste heat off their powerhouses in rural Alaska. They shouldn't be penalized with their PCE payments. So I guess with that, we have a broad spectrum of a lot of things going on here at AEA, continuing to work across the board. And I will say that I'm pleased to say that the legislature 2 years ago, the funding level at AEA for capital projects was zero. This last year was $56 million. So definitely the legislature is supporting AEA and the work that we're doing across the board. And we thank everybody here for their support in the legislature for that effort too. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Curtis. So rounding out our panel is Piper Foster Wilder. She is the founder of 60 Hertz Microgrids, a firm managing a maintenance software to manage and monitor grid tied and off-grid access. Additionally, Piper is a Humboldt Fellow and is former Vice President of Amatis Controls. She is committed to creating meaningful work for all people and enabling a transition to renewable energy while economizing the diesel that some must continue to use. She holds multiple awards for her entrepreneurship and social impact initiatives. So good morning, Piper.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you for the chance to be here. And it's just such a joy to see so many dear friends and colleagues on this call, both as panelists as well as attendees. So just to reiterate, 60 Hertz is a computerized maintenance management system software for distributed energy resources, which of course can include microgrids or even backup diesel generation and increasingly more and more renewables. If you are asking yourself, what is a computerized maintenance management system software, you are certainly not alone. And I definitely did not know what it was in 2017 when I started the company. In fact, 60 Hertz was initially intending to be a project finance vehicle to pay for remote renewable energy in the state. And on the way to that goal, as I began talking with investors about my idea, what I continued to hear from more seasoned, experienced individuals who had read numerous headlines in the state was that we had a maintenance problem, that if people did place this significant capital for remote solar and wind, that there needed to be a greater assurance that these assets would remain functional to achieve their full useful lifespan. And so I sat in on demos for maintenance software. I talked to 15 different companies in 2017 and learned that not one of them would work for the Alaskan environment, that they all demanded a great degree of professional expertise to navigate the software, and that it was cloud dependent. And we know in our state, there are many, many regions where there is no strong bandwidth or connectivity. And so because I can barely get a text message out on my own phone, I thought, well, we should just make our own app and we'll just create a software platform for this. And of all good graces, convinced two good friends to therefore join me on this mission. And so we started then pivoting, and 60 Hertz became a software company. On the way to that goal, developed just wonderful relationships and learned a lot from the field. Working with the Alaska Village Electric Cooperative and now 6 other utilities in the state to co-develop and deploy this software. We've spent more than 300 hours in the field following people, watching them work and conducting human-centered design. And so today, 60 Hertz is a full-fledged software startup company. We have venture backing. We are active in 65 communities in the state of Alaska with 5 utilities, and then another 10 communities across the Canadian Arctic with customers in the military. And leaning into something that Gwen said, that it's so inspiring that the Alaskan story is a great piece of transition and inspiration globally. And that has really proven true for 60 Hertz. So what we have long known is that the international community is looking to how Alaska has developed remote energy projects. I like to say that we have 13% of the microgrids in the world, but the longest operating experience of these microgrids, thanks to rural electrification, the Rural Electrification Act of the 1920s, which demanded bringing power to every remote and rural community, such that when Alaska became a state, we had rural powerhouses. And so Alaskans have been doing microgrids since long before they were sexy. But I like to say that this also means we know where the bodies are buried in terms of what doesn't work in the field. And that's a learning that people are leveraging for international development. 60 Hertz is proof of that. Today we have 220 sites in Africa. We are active in Benin, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And that has been really a joy to see the universality of some of the issues related to maintenance of our energy assets. And so what I can certainly say, and to the theme of the conversation today, is that as we are watching the cost, we have $147 million of assets that are being maintained on the 60 Hertz platform. And what we're observing is that the likelihood of catastrophic failure from diesel dependent assets is far greater, and that the maintenance costs are far greater for fossil energy. So when we're thinking about this from a budget standpoint, we love to say that the ribbon cutting is just day one. That's just the first thing to celebrate. But what happens then on is where we win our carbon goals and where we win the cost efficacy goals, and where we ultimately, from our standpoint, also create lots of wonderful jobs and jobs with dignity for people at all levels of the employment spectrum. What I want to think about right now is related to, we talk about the future and what questions I might pose or what I'm thinking about that could take the shape of where this conversation goes. The McKinley report says one of the key takeaways was that workforce development is something that the state must make investment in. And we couldn't agree more that vocational training, even if it's in an individual that will leave the role and move on to something else, that's also a good thing. That as we invest in our rural and remote communities, let alone even in the rail belt, that we start looking at job training as a continuum and as a lens of skill set that someone can gather here, but triage later to their next work. I'm thinking about a really meaningful story that just came up on a call recently. I was talking with a colleague at a co-op, a rural electric co-op in Colorado, where we're starting to do more work. And she said they sent out a member survey to all of their members and said, would you like to see more renewable energy on this grid? And a portion of her membership is in Moffat County, which is in a rural remote area of Colorado that previously has had a lot of coal-fired generation and a coal mine. But with the closure of those mines and the coordinate power plants, many people are out of a job. Each of the respondents from Moffat County to my colleague's member survey said, I don't want more renewable energy unless it's in this community, unless it's where I'm living here. And that touches me, because as we think about the transition and the opportunity for increased opportunity for all of us, the real attention to how we bring along and bring in individuals who might not necessarily find themselves to a green collar job, and how we help them be successful in that work is really critical. I happen to think that work with the computerized maintenance management software is actually a great way to increase someone's skill level, to ensure that they get their job done accurately, and to provide them the data that illustrates that they've performed good work on time. Something else that I'm thinking about a lot, another question that I have for the future, is how we bring more women to this work. There will be 800,000 new energy jobs globally over the next 10 years, and we're on track that 80% of them will be for men. An initiative that we're working on in sub-Saharan Africa is related to providing single gender cohorts of women who can become microgrid maintenance personnel, field techs. Of course, a lot has been done to teach women how to install solar, but what about the ongoing job? What about what happens again over those next 10 to 15 years? And that's very much true for the state of Alaska too. Of the 400 power plant operators that we're aware of in the state, microgrid operators across our state, 4 are women. but there's no reason that this couldn't be a more equal balance. And then finally, the last point I wanted to make is another question for the future I'm thinking about related to the phenomenal statistic that Curtis shared, that there's an $800 million deferred maintenance bill, just a staggering number that we need to think carefully about. And I think it's a really cool opportunity for public-private partnership that the original equipment manufacturers, major manufacturers that 60 Hertz is working with and talking to would love a piece of that. They would love to take it all. But it needs to be all. If it's in onesies and twosies, then it's not, the economies of scale are not there. But what would it look like if an RFP was issued to create a solar wind battery system with backup diesel in every one of our communities and drastically reduce this diesel dependence, harnessing the investment tax credit, working with Chris's Green Bank? I think there are so many ways for this to be a phenomenal win, and now's the moment. Now is the moment. We have the infrastructure bill, and we have old equipment that is only causing greater risk for our communities because diesel is so brittle and so easily compromised. So those are my questions for the future. And finally, I'll just close. This is the tagline for 60 Hertz, but I think it fits this conversation as well, which is we believe that maintenance is true sustainability. And each of our contributions to this conversation and the McKinley report, I think, really leverage this view of big picture thinking and large goals. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I don't even know where I want to start because I have so many notes to myself. But I think even though there was a lot of themes that continue to get repeated here that I'd love to touch on, I think I'll start with Gwen and Chris. Chris, I would love for you to sort of speak to what you think is the single most influential effort that we can do to have the most significant impact in Alaska. And then Gwen, I'd love for you to sort of follow up with what are we doing in Alaska that could have an even larger global impact? How can we extrapolate what we're doing in Alaska and either translate it elsewhere, export it elsewhere, work with others elsewhere? You know, something that everyone, not everyone, but several of you noted is that Alaskans are really inspiring. We're creative, we're entrepreneurs, we just get it done. And I would love to see that mentality be able to springboard this effort elsewhere. And so Chris, if you could speak specifically to Alaska, what's the single biggest thing that you think has the single most impact in Alaska right now? And then Gwen, if you can sort of speak to how we export that elsewhere, that would be great.
Well, thanks, Heidi. And when you say we, I'm assuming we, the royal we, the state of Alaska, us as a society, not individuals.
Correct.
And to me, that is clearly going to be policy and vision. We have to have an energy vision for this state that's different than the one we've had in the past. We've been an oil and gas state, but that has not necessarily been a good thing for oil and gas consumers here in the state. We don't get a hometown discount. As I pointed out, we're already paying more than twice as much for natural gas and cook inlet as we pay, as utilities pay in the lower 48. We know how expensive liquid fossil fuels are in the villages, highly expensive, some of the most expensive energy in the country. So we have to think about oil and gas as economic drivers. It's been a great thing for the state of Alaska in terms of our economy, but it's not been an energy policy for Alaskan consumers. How are Alaskans going to produce and consume energy 50 years from now? We have to understand that other places are thinking that far out. The Chinese are thinking 250 years out. We have to have a long-term vision that really looks much more broadly at all the other resources we have, including energy efficiency. And I would just end the answer with, why wouldn't Alaska want to be the most energy efficient place on the planet?
Well, and to that point, Chris, perhaps I should have just had you guys answer the inverted question. You answer, what could we import from other countries? I mean, if you look at the Middle East, they're hugely into oil and gas. They've used oil and gas to support their economies quite well for quite some time, but many of those countries are pivoting to solar and some other energy resources to position themselves in the future for whenever fossils either run out or are passe. And so maybe the question should have been, what can we import? And Gwen can answer, what can we export?
Thank you. Thanks, Heidi. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting to me is partially, and this is kind of Chris, he kind of talks about things as falling into 4 buckets, like people, technology, policy, and oh gosh, Chris, what's the 4th one? Money, of course. And I think that one of the things that is interesting is just kind of the way we've built up our entire sort of ecosystem in Alaska. So there's that piece of it. Like, for example, the Renewable Energy Fund, which has been really instrumental in terms of seeing this significant increase in renewable energy development in the state. That was very much developed through a grassroots effort, right? That wasn't a top-down approach. That was a bottoms-up, like with the stakeholders getting together, organized by Chris through the Renewable Energy Alaska project to really get that put into a program that could benefit Alaskans and be a source of income, or not really a source of income, but a source of funding for some of these projects initially. And now, as Curtis says, we can't be relying on grants forever. We've got to figure out how to transition over to more loan-based sources of funding. Well, what that means in Alaska and what that's meant for a long time is that our projects need to be economic, right? So we're not just thinking about this from the standpoint of like, can we just drop really expensive renewable energy projects into remote areas, and if you put enough money at it, if you throw enough money at it, engineers can figure out a way to make it work, right? But the thing is, and this kind of goes back to this whole conversation with Piper and Jen, is like, we don't just want to make it work. It has to be viable from an economic standpoint, and it has to be viable from a long-term operations and maintenance standpoint. And we need to be thinking about that. And I think in general, Alaskans are doing our best to think about that. There's lots that we all can think of, lots of examples of where things have not worked perfectly, but we're doing really well in this area compared to other places. And this is kind of my observation. I'm going to put on my academic hat right now. We've been really looking at projects on a global basis, especially around the circumpolar Arctic, and Alaska is a place where there's been more activity in terms of developing renewables. Why is that? Are we more innovative than people in Canada? Not necessarily, right? Some of this is really about the structures and institutional structures, our subsidy structure. So we talk about the power cost equalization program. That's an incredibly important subsidy for our rural communities and for folks living in high energy cost part of the state. But that subsidy is not so high that it really creates these sort of economic barriers to market entry for renewables. Our utilities are often, there's a lot of cooperative utilities in the state. That structure is very much like sort of controlled at the local level. And so you have this like simplified decision-making process where, and this is kind of interesting in other places, we've actually done analyses related to sort of cooperative structures for utilities, maybe tribally owned utilities in other places. It creates sort of streamlined opportunities for approving and moving forward with project development and keeping decision-making at the local level with a lot of these things. I saw a question, I think from John Springsteen about the cost of battery systems. So I'll give an example of where I think that, a very specific one of where I think we can export expertise and know-how from Alaska related to energy storage. Batteries cost a lot of money. They're just expensive. You know, if you wanted to add a huge amount of energy storage, you could firm up a lot of variable renewable resources and solve a lot of problems, but it's going to make it uneconomical to deploy those kinds of projects. And so what we have been doing is looking at ways to really keep that battery storage system as small as possible by using other innovative strategies. And a lot of that is real different than what's been done in other places. We're really looking at managed loads and centrally controlling like loads, being able to turn those on and off based on whether there is excess wind power available or not. A lot of that is going into things like thermal energy, right? Heating individual structures. So our utilities and our communities are thinking about their energy utility as more of an energy utility and not an electric power utility. We're really thinking about these things on a pretty holistic basis. And these are not things that are happening in other places. So there's both that technology solution space where we don't always need to go to batteries. That doesn't always have to be the solution, especially not big batteries in remote places that are going to cause longer term O&M, challenges. I'm not suggesting that storage doesn't have a role, but it is going to increase the cost of projects. And so really looking at this from a holistic standpoint and saying, like, can you actually balance the grid? Can you regulate some of these renewables by having sheddable loads in the form of heat or other sorts of sources that you can control at the utility level? This is pretty commonly done in Alaska right now by almost every single utility that has a wind farm today, but it's not something that's thought about in other markets as like your first thing that you want to be focusing on. So I think there's a lot of these opportunities that we have, whether they're more policy or institutional structure, or if it's like specific technology solutions. I'm just gonna end by saying that we're trying to find ways to really export this expertise in a pretty like kind of a mechanism for that, because a lot of the folks that have the most know-how in Alaska are working for nonprofits. Almost all of our utilities in rural Alaska are some form of a nonprofit. So they don't have a motive. There's no mechanism to like sell your expertise or really get engaged in projects elsewhere, because your focus is on your local consumers and customers, right? Especially around this cooperative structure. So we put together a group called the Alaska Microgrid Group that really pools talent across all of these different cooperative utilities around the state, like Cordova, like Kodiak, like Kotzebue, the ones that are really Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, the ones that are really doing some of these very forward-facing things. And we want to see where there's opportunity for us to export some of that know-how and knowledge and work on projects in other markets. So that's a big piece of what we're doing. It's a nonprofit organization. It's not for profit, but the idea is really like, how can we, in an organized way, pool Alaska talent and use that to support projects in other markets?
And just really quickly, Gwen, has that cooperative sort of approached the federal government as a way of sort of tapping into a larger market and outsourcing its intellectual capital?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to work with folks on this. This is a pretty new program. Actually, Chris Rose has been pretty involved with helping stand this up as well. And it's something I do want folks to be aware of, because I think it's a real opportunity in my mind to pool Alaska talent, find a way that we can actually export this. It actually builds on models of processes that Iceland has developed previously. So we've kind of built on what Iceland has done in some of these areas where they've really set themselves as the center of the universe for geothermal technologies. We think Alaska can be the center of the universe for microgrid technologies and microgrid supporting types of technologies. And so the Alaska Microgrid Group is really intended to be that lens through which we can operate internationally, pull in information from other places that we could benefit from, but then also push out know-how and knowledge from Alaska. So I could drop in the chat here at least a link to some information on that, or if anyone's interested, they can contact me later.
That'd be great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So Jen, you spoke a little bit about transferring existing oil and gas job skills to the renewable space. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to that more specifically, and sort of what that looks like and how that really translates.
Sure. Yeah, so all projects kind of follow a standard process, whether it's an oil and gas or a utilities project, and I would imagine even potentially software. But you're scoping in the project. You're saying, okay, what's the value of the project? You're doing a screening. Is it technically feasible? And so you need cost estimates for that, engineering analysis for that, and so you're just running that screening process, and then next you're going to kind of further define the project. What exact technology? How are we going to interconnect this? Do grid studies. And then finally, you're getting into construction and building, and then an operation. And so, engineers, physics is the same everywhere, is a huge advantage. And so, when you understand technical problems and analyzing financial technical situations, whether you've done that in oil and gas or in renewable energy, all those skills apply. Economic modeling with cash flow analysis, engineering, technical design. There's a ton of electrical controls projects even in oil and gas, and now we're applying that to renewable energy. And then even on the job side, what's been really neat about solar from a construction standpoint is, the technology is very easy to install. Sometimes our CFO, and it's more complicated than this, but sometimes they'll joke, hey, we're kind of building like a glorified fence here. And so, you're putting in pile, and it is more prestigious and complicated than that. But, you're putting in foundation piles, which, if you're doing buildings or any other kind of project, you're like, okay, let's look at the soils and geotech, and we're evaluating what type of foundation to do. We're attaching the, putting up the piles, the racking, you're installing the panels. And a lot of those jobs you can learn on the job. I would say 90% of the folks we hired, they were learning on the job. And the year before that, we were teaching ourselves and learning, what's the most efficient way, as our Willow pilot, the 4 partners actually built themselves. I would never do that again by myself, but anyway, so it's a really, I would say, an inviting industry. And in comparison to oil and gas has so many hazard concerns. You're looking at, what if we have an overpressure situation, the plant operations get out of spec, and you're worried about these really high hazard events, and you're handling very hazardous materials or highly flammable. And so when we talk about solar, you've really taken the risk level down, and that's what's kind of neat about some of these new technologies is the risk to construction and operation is so much lower. It's a very friendly job to have that is much lower risk than traditional oil and gas jobs. And so, yeah, a lot of those, and then we're hiring electricians and linemen, to do all the electrical work and tying into the grid. And so it's just, it's a lot of the same technical skills, and the project follows that standard kind of appraise, select, define, execute process of all traditional projects. And so it's just, we've really found that our skills do transfer. You're looking at a new technology and you're coming up to speed. Well, what's unique about this technology, and where are the value points? And so those things you have to learn through analysis. But having worked in industry, for really anyone that's worked in industry, probably 3 to 5 years could transfer very easily over to renewable energy. And on the construction side, you can join day one and learn on the job. And honestly, one of the things when we were starting this company is all of a sudden we realized, oh my gosh, we're going to have to create a construction industry. Like we want to do these solar projects, but we need to create the industry that will build these, and the workforce that will build these. And it was really cool for me, when we did the Willow project, I heard, we worked side by side with our employees, and just to hear the number of reports of like, wow, this is such a great job. Like, it's, it was very rewarding to see the solar farm go up fairly quickly. And again, not having like the high hazard. And we actually had, I would say, I need to double check the numbers, Piper, but probably 50% women, and we're fairly, we have a female CEO, myself, and we're very pro equal opportunity for all folks of all backgrounds. And I think that's what's kind of inviting about renewable energy is everyone has an opportunity to work in it. And so anyway, so I think there's, skills really do transfer. There is, more high tech stuff like what Piper's doing, like, software engineering, where maybe we don't have as much background of that here in the state. But as far as construction jobs, engineering jobs, project management, finance, those skills all transfer. And it's kind of neat to see that we can employ folks across a whole bunch of sectors.
Great, thank you, Jen. So Piper, I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't know if you're the right person to answer it, but I'm going to pose it to you, and obviously pivot to someone else if you think there's someone better to address it. So one of the questions that came in was that in Southeast Alaska, our communities are driven by hydro, but climate change and the ensuing droughts have forced our communities to resort to diesel, which is more expensive and further exacerbates the issue in the long run. Is the technology at the level to support 15,000 sized communities? And what would the initial investment look like to realize the project of that size? As well as, is there any data, and this is the part that I really was kind of honing in, I suspect you have some of this data, to show that the investment cost is offset by converting off of diesel to hydro?
Oh, sure. Thanks for the question. I see Grant put that, and I think there's absolutely abundant evidence that the technology there, I think we say the technology, we're speaking about renewable energy, or a suite of renewable energy generation technologies, would work and would be cost effective. I'd put an answer to a prior question that was in a similar vein on this, where we talk about the upfront cost versus the long-term cost. I think what's especially interesting in Alaska, and I'm the only one I think that's talking about this, but I'm curious if others, maybe I need to talk to more people probably, but maybe others are thinking about this too, which is when our remote communities enter into a power purchase agreement, where a provider like Gen would be offering those kilowatt hours, Gen would actually own the generation infrastructure for your community grant, then I think it's a really clever way to deploy PCE funds. I think it's very economically efficient because PCE does not define fuel as diesel, but you are remunerated for that expense. And I think it's a really clever way that we could start encouraging this activity. Now, if I'm wrong about that, someone should definitely intervene and correct. But I think that mechanism with an independent power producer, with deploying PCE, and then I hope with Chris's forthcoming green bank that could also help the community provide some of their own capital to the project too. It absolutely would be more cost effective, and we only need to look to Kodiak Electric, let alone many other examples of where we can see that being true. I'll quickly defer in case what I've said is incorrect, but that's what my modeling is showing.
Well, and I was going to follow up with you, Curtis, but go ahead.
No, on a couple points. I think one thing to remember is when we look at Kodiak in particular, they received close to over $44 million of state funding to get them to where they're at. So that's one of the things is when the state is flush with oil money, we have been able to be proactive in renewables with the Renewable Energy Fund, among others. So I think there's a balance there. One of the things that I know that we have one particular community that used to receive PCE, the state invested $3.6 million in their community for them to go hydro. Now they fell below the PCE threshold, and then now they have an issue that they lost money by going renewable. So there's some tweaks that we probably need to do to the power cost equalization. But I think the one thing that's real important to note is opening that up is one of the reasons it didn't get funded right now. It's a $1 billion fund. That $1.1 billion is the PCE endowment. But I think one thing that people have to understand about that endowment, and we try to educate the legislators on this, the state has invested in infrastructure along the rail belt. The state built Bradley, they built the intertie, they built that infrastructure. They gave tax credits to find no more natural gas in Cook Inlet. They spent way over $1 billion. The endowment for PCE was their investment. They took the money and it was put in an endowment. Thank you to Senator Hoffman. And now they live off the earnings of that to help offset those high costs of energy. But we need to figure as renewables go on and they drop down below the PCE level, which should be the goal, that there's some equalization there. Maybe we can help them with PCE to get them to where they need to be in the renewable field. One thing I'm going to do a mic drop just real quick. One thing that we've not talked about at all, and I'm not advocating one way or another, but it's Susitna-Wantana. We've talked about immediate. If we want to go renewable from the rail belt at 30% to well over 60 to 70 cents, it's a mega project, and that mega project is Susitna-Wantana, and the state's invested $200 million for an FERC license. They're about $100 million shy of probably getting that FERC license. And so at some point we need to have that conversation. If that is still a goal of the state, is to pursue a mega project that can take us to 60 or 70% rail belt at cost less than natural gas, which is becoming more scarce and the price is going up. But that needs to be part of the larger conversation. I think for anybody when we talk about renewables is what is the state's goal, because that's a mega project that immediately changes the numbers. So.
Does anyone want to respond to that project before I ask Curtis a follow-up question?
Well, I'll say something, Heidi, and that is we're excited that last year the legislature passed a bill that mandates that the rail belt develop an electric reliability organization, which is happening right now. And one of the things that ERO is going to do is integrated resource planning. And so the integrated resource plan will look at the technical and economic feasibility of all projects and decide what the rail belt needs. Because there's going to be an opportunity cost for every dollar that we spend. And the ERO is going to develop an IRP that looks at both transmission and generation projects. And I think that all the projects should go into that hopper and be evaluated on a level playing field.
Awesome. So Curtis, Piper said something that I wanted to follow up with you on, and forgive me if my information is stale because it is indeed a little bit stale, but Piper mentioned entering into power purchase agreements and then having the PCE pay for that over the long term. And certainly I've worked on a lot of power purchase agreements over the years. And one of the things that I was always familiar with was that it was challenging to sort of demonstrate the ability to finance the project and pay for it over time in some of the villages. And so I guess I'm wondering, does AEA play any role, or does it collaborate with any other state agency to sort of, I don't know, back that ability to finance so that there's comfort level to go into these communities and invest that infrastructure and allow them to pay for the infrastructure over 30 years or something?
We've had those conversations with communities, and there's been a lot of interest, I think, in different communities selling them renewables or some other power source using the PC as a backstop. We have shied away from that and shied communities away from it, is because if we go in and they pledge the PCE, which is to lower the cost, but they pledge that PCE for a company that then, let's say, walks away in 5 years, yet they have that pledge ongoing to a third party. So we've shied away from doing PCE to third parties, because it's for the focus for the communities. And PCE is strictly for residential. It's not for commercial projects or commercial customers. It's for residential. So I think that's probably maybe a larger discussion to have. But like I said, we've witnessed people go into communities or with all the great intentions, but the project goes bust. And if it was tied to a PCE payment for the next 20 or 30 years, that community would be then looking for money to offset that somewhere else. But it probably is something for a larger discussion.
Heidi, may I reply to that, or just
of course, everybody, it's open to everyone. I'm just trying to help.
Well, I appreciate Curtis's point, because yeah, we've got to be really careful with then the fly-by-night developer. And I mean, Chris Rose was the first one that educated me about the risk. Alaska is such a shiny object for entities from the lower 40, people who just really don't comprehend what work is like here, that it is a huge risk. And I think a place that when we think about setting communities up for success and setting communities up to retain as much sovereignty as possible over their assets, I think there are some emerging data sets. I know that ASAP has got several. I think the Rural Utility Business Advisor Network has some. I think Department of Local Affairs. I think there's, sorry, that was a different acronym, but that there are entities within the state that are getting really good data that for developers that are proven and that have the best interest of doing well by our communities, I think would be right to assess and to validate. I mean, to a certain extent, 60 Hertz maintenance data is also showing that too, of where I would place my investment going forward. So I think this is the kind of conversation that would compel how we do renewables well. I'll say something provocative, and I'm happy to say that maybe I only believe it 80%, and so don't kick me under the table, but I think that there is something to not providing renewables through grants anymore. I think that was fundamental. I think it was wise. I think it was critical in the early days. And I so honor the leadership sitting on this call that led that. I think a downside and unintended consequence is that for any of us when we get something totally for free that you don't even have a dollar in the game for. That the ability for that asset to be looked after properly long term and to achieve its full useful life we've seen some black eyes as a result of this, and it hasn't gone as well as everyone would hope. That said, there is a role for loans. There is a way that we can help, again, provide sovereignty and enfranchise our communities. We just need to do it carefully, and the impulse for grants may no longer be serving us all, is my perspective.
Yeah. Thanks. Jen, there's a question that came in. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, do you mind if I respond to the
No,
grant
just
loan
quickly. I want to
comment?
get to one more question. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and Piper, I would, and Curtis, I would emphasize, I think loans are the way to go. Renewables have, the cost has come down, that we're now beyond the need for grants. And I think there's some scars left over from folks like, oh, this is just another kind of boondoggle project. It doesn't make sense. And, there's just not there's doubt in the minds of the public when they hear that there's, so much grant money involved. And so, the Alaska Energy Authority, their Power Project Fund, that was, in my mind, that was an early green bank for us, because we used the loan program to fund 50% of our Willow project. And we couldn't have gotten on our feet without it. And it's having the low interest debt is critical for these renewable energy projects. And it's great to be able to be paying back that debt to the state, and that they're getting some interest on it. So I think it's just a win-win.
Great, thank you.
Just a quick plug. The PPF loan fund is 2.85% interest right now. It fluctuates with a 52-week average, but it's 2.85%. So it's probably the best money on the street.
So there's a question that came in very early, and Gwen touched on it, but I just wanted to read it so that everyone had the benefit of hearing it and see if there was anything else they wanted to add to it. John asked, self-sufficient, resilient communities need economic engines, tourism, seafood, minerals, mariculture, IT, call center services, et cetera, that bring new, i.e. federal and state monies into their communities. How does economic engine development factor into renewable energy planning discussions, and what opportunities are you pursuing for partnerships between commercial and industrial developers and the renewable energy development? So that's kind of an open question for anyone who feels like answering it. If we can keep it kind of short, because there's one more question I want to get to.
I'll just take that one, John. And the reason I'll just grab it is because this is part of the conversation that we're having right now in Cordova. We have a group that's coming together that's not just looking at energy innovation, which I talked about earlier, but really looking at how that sort of energy innovation or the opportunity for lower cost energy can really support local economic development, not just here in Cordova, but also across the region, in this case, Prince William Sound. We're really working closely here with the Ocean Energy Cluster. We're really working on this as sort of like looking at how energy can work closely with the community to look at a solid foundation for an economic future for communities like Cordova, where you've got a situation where, because probably due in part to climate change, you're seeing changes to the fisheries, right? Maybe salmon stocks are moving further north, and Prince William Sound might have to adapt a little bit in terms of like what its fisheries are, looking at value-added processing. How can they take advantage of affordable energy here to make themselves more competitive on an international and national basis? And so those are exactly, I think, the kinds of conversations we have, because at the end of the day, cheap, affordable energy is fantastic, but energy is a tool for other things, for achieving other goals, and having a sustainable economy in local places is pretty important. I'm going to allude back to Iceland. In some of the most remote places in Iceland, they have access to very, very cheap energy, but they're still seeing out-migration of the population because they don't see opportunity for really high-paying jobs for their youth. And so you still see out-migration. And so it's really about like, how can we keep people and give them opportunities in their communities that really connect to a larger global economy, and whether that's related to energy or whether that's something that energy is a instrument of providing, I think that that's exactly where we need to be going. And that's why I'm excited to see you as part of like this economic development task force, thinking about energy issues for the state, but also looking at that through the lens of like affordable energy strategies for Alaskans.
I would just add
And
that, energy is driver for everything. And there is a stranded renewable energy assets report out there that ASAP and NREL worked on some time ago. And I think we have to start thinking out of the box and taking, projects to where the energy might be. A lot of this renewable energy is all over the Aleutians, for instance. I've talked to more than one renewable energy developer in the last 6 months about restarting the Agrium natural gas fertilizer plant, or excuse me, the fertilizer plant. They used to rely on natural gas to get hydrogen with green hydrogen. That's just an example of a local industry that was really a big anchor for the Kenai Peninsula that's been out of business for a while, that was using hydrogen from natural gas. Well, now we're getting to the point where we can make hydrogen else in other ways. So it's a really good point, John.
so, and I'm sorry to circle back to Gwen, but there was another question directed specifically to her, and it was actually a question that I wanted to ask too, which relates to the vertical integration that you referenced earlier. If you could just speak to that a little bit more and articulate what that looks like and what that really means.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think there's two parts to that answer. Like, number one is that because our villages, a lot of our utilities are very close to, are basically owned by community members, right? Whether it's a municipal or tribally owned utility, or it's a cooperatively owned utility, we really have these opportunities for doing things differently than I'm thinking about, like in Northern Canada, where you've got crown corporations and this additional level of sort of bureaucracy that can be a barrier at times to seeing projects developed. Like, the communities might want the project, but they don't have a lot of local control or jurisdiction over the utility. But at the same time, the other way of thinking of vertical integration is that our utilities are thinking about themselves as more of like this whole pipeline for energy supply. So you've got a community or a utility like AVAC that actually owns the barges that delivers fuel to their communities in southwestern Alaska, right? And that's all about trying to avoid a monopoly and seeing increases in the cost of fuel oil to their communities. They own the generation assets, and they're also looking at heat as a byproduct from their energy services that they're providing. So they're really thinking about this from a much more holistic standpoint that gives you a lot more opportunity to interact with different pieces of that puzzle. They look at energy efficiency, quite a bit as a piece of all of this. So that gives you an opportunity to really impact things across a much bigger spectrum than you might be able to for a utility company somewhere else that's just providing that one single service. It's much more thinking about the benefits to the community as a whole and thinking about energy holistically. It's a pretty unique structure to Alaska that I actually think is pretty great. At the same time, there's been some reference to these very small communities. Community capacity is a major factor in whether communities successfully develop and maintain projects over time. Some communities have high capacity inherently located in the community, but because they're so small, often pooling resources across multiple communities, whether through AVAC or other sorts of sources, is another way that you can kind of build capacity across multiple communities, pool resources in order to see successful project development. So there's just some cool things happening in Alaska that I don't think are similar to other places that I think we should pay attention to and understand. That's why we have had some of the successes we have, and those could be duplicated in other places.
Awesome. So John asked if he could get a copy of the Stranded Renewable Energy Report. And so Chris, if you can make that available in the links that also go out to the participants, that would be great. Okay, thank you.
I don't have the link right now. I'm not going to put it in the chat, but we can dig it up. And in fact, Gwen might have it closer to her than I do.
Oh, okay, great.
It's a report that we put together. And John, I'd love to update that report. I feel like it's a little bit outdated right now, but the concept behind it of really looking more holistically at our resources in the state, I think is still pretty valid.
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for their participation this morning. This was really fun. It was fun for me to kind of jump back into renewable energy and be able to have this conversation with all of you. I would like to thank all the participants for joining us this morning and providing us with some questions and your thinking on where things are at. I would just like to ask that you all engage in the Alaska Climate Opportunities Assessment throughout the summer and the fall as a statewide bipartisan dialogue. And it sure was a pleasure. I just wanted to flag the dates of future events in case all of us are interested in joining later. On July 29th, there'll be a climate innovation conversation. On August 5th, there will be a leading resilient infrastructure conversation. On September 16th, there'll be Alaska's emerging natural climate solutions conversation. And September 28th, there will be an Alaska fisherman conversation. This will be recorded and it will likely be available on YouTube in the coming days. It'll certainly be sent out, any links that we have, to the participants who participated. Let's see, is there anything else that we need to mention? I thank you all for your time. And if there are any closing goodbyes, please do those now quickly.
Thanks, Heidi, and thanks to the Nature Conservancy.